Welcome to our deep dive into the world of financial crises. We're going to unpack some seriously thought-provoking ideas from George Cooper's book, The Origin of Financial Crises. You want to know how these colossal economic meltdowns occur, why they seem to haunt us repeatedly, and the role those enigmatic central banks play.
Cooper boldly challenges the efficient market theory many economists consider gospel, asserting it doesn't accurately reflect reality.
That's a bold claim because on the surface, the efficient market concept sounds pretty logical. Supply and demand keep markets stable, with prices adjusting fluidly. Scarcity increases prices, encourages production, which then lowers prices again. It seems pretty neat and tidy, right?
Well, Cooper throws a wrench into that neat equation, arguing it doesn't hold up for assets like stocks or real estate.
Oh, okay.
He illustrates this with high-priced art and luxury goods. People don't necessarily purchase fewer luxury items as prices rise. Sometimes the allure of exclusivity and cost actually drives demand higher.
So it's not always about basic needs or rational decision-making. It sounds more like a status symbol kind of thing.
Precisely. This same principle can apply to assets where investors seek price increases defying the traditional supply-demand equilibrium. This sets the stage for bubbles where prices detach from reasonable valuations.
That's why Cooper's critique of the efficient market hypothesis is so important. If he's right, massive events like the 2008 financial crisis or the dot-com bubble shouldn't have been possible. So what does their occurrence tell us?
It suggests deeper, more volatile forces within financial systems than conventional economic models capture.
That brings us to Hyman Minsky and his financial instability hypothesis, which suggests financial systems are inherently unstable, prone to the booms and busts Cooper describes. The primary culprit, according to Minsky: credit.
Private sector credit essentially creates new money, along with debt. They emerge as a pair, almost like two sides of the same coin.
So they just materialize out of thin air, impacting our tangible world.
Indeed. This new credit fuels economic booms, creating a sense of prosperity, leading to business investments and home purchases. But this party can't last forever.
There's always a catch. What's the downside of this credit creation?
The debt must be repaid eventually. That repayment can drain the economy's vitality, triggering a downturn. Think of it like a sugar rush, followed by an energy crash.
That's where those mysterious institutions, central banks, step in, right?
Exactly. Central banks were initially envisioned as a stabilizing force, the lender of last resort when banks faced difficulties. Their role was to temper this inherent instability Minsky described.
Like economic firefighters putting out financial blazes.
You could view it that way. But this safety net can inadvertently encourage risky behavior. If banks anticipate bailouts, are they more likely to make reckless loans? It's the classic moral hazard dilemma.
This links to the debate about whether central banks actually worsen the situation.
Indeed.
Okay.
Cooper argues that modern central banks fixated on controlling inflation through interest rates may overlook the broader picture of credit growth and potential bubbles. This myopic focus on consumer prices can distract from the larger systemic risks building up.
He even proposes that recent policies like the Fed's risk management paradigm may unintentionally fuel these cycles by fostering excessive risk-taking.
That's a thought-provoking assertion. It compels us to reconsider the role of central banks and whether their well-intentioned interventions create unintended consequences.
If managing credit is key, how do we assess risk in a system as intricate as the global economy? I mean, it's not like we can just run a simple calculation.
Cooper highlights that we often perceive risk as quantifiable, like calculating odds in a dice roll.
But in the real world, especially with the economy, we're dealing with what former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called unknown unknowns, things we cannot even anticipate, right?
Correct. He uses the analogy of a dice game where the numbers are hidden. Calculating odds becomes virtually impossible.
That's the difficulty with the financial system. Complex models and risk assessments can crumble when unforeseen events arise.
Precisely. Events deemed impossible by traditional economic theory keep occurring. This suggests we need entirely new ways of thinking about and managing risk.
So if Cooper's critique of the efficient market hypothesis is valid, what's the alternative?
He advocates for a minimalist approach to central banking, focusing on credit growth management instead of continuous economic fine-tuning through intervention.
Can you elaborate on what a minimalist approach to central banking would look like?
He suggests we must accept that some downturns are inevitable and attempting to prevent them entirely can be counterproductive.
That sounds pretty controversial, especially given the desire for stability. It's human nature to want to avoid pain, but maybe a little economic discomfort now and then is actually healthy in the long run.
That's a great way to put it. It's like saying we need to let the body fight off some infections on its own to build a stronger immune system.
That makes sense. So what does all this mean for our listeners? If the efficient market theory is flawed, how should we think about investing or even understanding how the economy functions?
That's a critical question. It suggests we should be more skeptical of neat economic models and more aware of the complex, often unpredictable nature of financial markets.
Perhaps we need a little less confidence in our ability to predict and control these forces. I'm starting to feel like we're just scratching the surface here. What other insights does Cooper offer? It seems like Cooper's saying there's more to risk than just numbers and models.
He delves into the intricacies of risks, asserting it's not just about quantifiable models and numbers.
Yeah, there's that whole psychological aspect to risk, how we perceive and react to it. It's like that feeling you get when you're about to go on a roller coaster, a mix of fear and excitement,
We often treat risk as if it can be precisely quantified like a mathematical formula.
right?
But as evidenced by the 2008 crisis and numerous other events, those formulas can fail dramatically when confronted with the unforeseen.
It's almost like those formulas create a false sense of security, leading us to believe we have more control than we actually do.
That's precisely Cooper's emphasis. He urges us to move beyond the simplistic notion of measurable risk and acknowledge the presence of unknown unknowns.
Things we can't even imagine, let alone accurately measure. That's a bit unsettling, to say the least.
It's akin to navigating uncharted territory. You might have a map, but it won't show you every hidden obstacle or unexpected turn.
Which strengthens Cooper's argument for abandoning the efficient market hypothesis. If we cling to a model that disregards these unpredictable elements, we're setting ourselves up for potential disaster.
Absolutely. We require a more realistic, perhaps humbler approach to understanding the workings of financial markets.
This leads to one of Cooper's most controversial propositions, that central banks, in their attempts to smooth out economic cycles, might actually be exacerbating the problem.
His criticism centers around the idea that by constantly intervening to prevent downturns, central banks distort natural market mechanisms.
It's like constantly giving someone antibiotics for every minor ailment. You might suppress the symptoms in the short term, but you weaken their immune system, making them more susceptible to future illnesses.
That's an apt analogy.
Thanks.
Cooper advocates for a more hands-off approach, allowing the market to self-correct, even if it entails experiencing some discomfort in the process.
Of course, that's easier said than done. Politicians and voters often demand immediate solutions, even if those solutions might create larger issues down the road. It's a classic case of short-term thinking versus long-term consequences.
It's a delicate balancing act, but Cooper stresses that we must consider the long-term repercussions of those short-term interventions. Perhaps those interventions, while seemingly helpful, are delaying the inevitable reckoning and making the eventual correction even more severe.
Which brings us to the ongoing debate about the role of central banks.
Right.
Are they the heroes safeguarding the financial system or unwitting accomplices in its instability?
The answer probably lies somewhere in between, a complex interplay of positive and negative effects, depending on the specific circumstances. It's not a simple black and white issue.
So if we embrace Cooper's critique of the efficient market hypothesis, where does that leave us? You're the practical implications for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this.
It means recognizing that the financial system isn't as rational and predictable as we might wish. It's influenced by a complex web of factors, including human psychology and unforeseen events.
And that we need to be more vigilant about the role of credit creation and the potential for speculative bubbles. It's not just about looking at traditional economic indicators, it's about understanding the underlying dynamics that can drive markets to unsustainable levels.
Precisely. And perhaps most importantly, we need to be ready for the unavoidable shocks and downturns inherent in the natural rhythm of the market. Instead of fearing these downturns, we should see them as opportunities for correction and renewal, a chance to clear out excesses and build a more sustainable foundation.
So rather than constantly seeking to eliminate all risk, perhaps we should focus on building resilience and adapting to changing conditions.
That's a valuable insight.
We've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into George Cooper's The Origin of Financial Crises.
We've questioned some widely held assumptions about the functioning of financial markets.
And we've explored the intricate and often contradictory role of central banks in this system.
We've also grappled with the complex issue of risk in a system increasingly susceptible to unpredictable shocks.
Before we wrap up, I believe it would be beneficial to distill Cooper's key arguments into a concise 10-point summary.
That's a great suggestion. It will provide our listeners with some tangible takeaways to reflect upon.
Okay, let's start with the foundation of Cooper's critique. Number one, the efficient market hypothesis, which postulates that markets are rational, stable, and self-correcting, is fundamentally flawed.
Number two, asset markets like those for stocks and real estate can defy the traditional laws of supply and demand, resulting in speculative bubbles driven by leverage and herd behavior.
Number three, financial systems, as Hyman Minsky argued, are inherently unstable, prone to booms and busts fueled by credit creation and psychological factors that can drive irrational exuberance and panic.
Number four, central bank initially intended as stabilizers of the financial system can unintentionally contribute to this instability through their interventions and the moral hazard they generate.
Number five, monetary policies solely focused on controlling consumer price inflation often neglect the crucial role of credit growth and asset bubbles in driving broader economic cycles.
Number six, the popular notion of quantitative risk management, while helpful, frequently fails to account for unknown unknowns and can lead to a false sense of security.
Number seven, the data used to assess economic health can be distorted by credit cycles, making it difficult to differentiate genuine growth from unsustainable bubbles. It's like trying to measure the height of a wave while you're in the middle of a storm.
Number eight, policymakers should prioritize managing credit growth, not eliminating all economic downturns. They need to acknowledge that some degree of volatility is not only inevitable, but potentially beneficial in the long run.
Number nine, a minimalist approach to central banking involving less intervention and more reliance on market mechanisms might be a more sustainable long-term strategy.
And finally, number 10, we need new ways of thinking about and managing risk that recognize the inherent uncertainty and complexity of the financial system. We need to move beyond simplistic bodies and embrace a more adaptive and resilient approach.
That concludes our 10-point summary of Cooper's key insights. It's a lot to digest, but hopefully it provides our listeners with a framework for understanding the forces shaping the financial world and the challenges we face in navigating it.
We've only scratched the surface, of course, but hopefully we've provided some food for thought and perhaps sparked a desire to delve deeper into these fascinating and vitally important issues.
This deep dive has certainly been an eye-opener for me. I'm starting to see the economy in a whole new light.
It's a journey of continuous discovery.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do with this new understanding?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. How can they apply these insights to their own financial decisions?
Until next time, dear listeners, keep exploring and stay curious. It's important to remember that the insights we've discussed represent just one perspective on a multifaceted and constantly evolving topic.
Right, and there are countless other voices and viewpoints out there, and we encourage you to explore them, to seek out diverse opinions and challenge your own assumptions.
Engaging in critical thinking is crucial, especially when dealing with something as impactful as the financial system. It's not about blindly accepting any one expert's view, but about developing your own informed perspective.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions, challenging conventional wisdom, and seeking out a range of viewpoints. That's how we learn, grow, and hopefully make more informed decisions both individually and as a society.
Those are wise words to live by. And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive into the origin of financial crises to a close. It's been a fascinating journey.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you and hopefully stimulating some deeper thinking about how financial systems work.
Until next time, dear listeners, keep diving deep and never stop questioning.